Before I start on the China discussion, I'm in Greenville, South Carolina, and the tragedy that's going on down here, and it just had me reflecting on the problems around the world and how many people are suffering so badly right now. It's just the devastation in the southeast of the U.S. is pretty bad, but we have devastation all over the world right now. We got to get our act together as a global population. But today's topic is on China stimulus. Last week was quite a week. We had outside of China, Russia trying to discuss new red lines for nuclear, the Middle East conflict escalating in a very disturbing way, and then China rolled out its new stimulus efforts while the markets continue to hit new highs in the U.S. and you saw big rebounds in other markets around the world. Let me start by saying I've been a big fan of China's progress for quite some time, but I think 11 years ago, President Xi was selling the China dream, which was a vision that had the country as the world's soon to be the world's greatest power, reclaiming its rightful place in history. I don't think the promise has worked out as planned, as the weak economy and the government's heavy hand has led to some challenges there, and we'll get into that now. So China pulled out what we've been waiting for some time, which was some stimulus efforts to try and move the economy forward and reverse the trend that's been going on for a while. The question is going to be, is it enough? And I think the reaction from yesterday or last night is maybe not, but I think China has to be careful about how they approach stimulus right now, given the debt problems that they have. So I think it's going to be interesting to see, but the stock market rebounded a bit right off the bat, but will it be enough to reverse the growth trends that they've had for some time? Now, naturally from 14 and double-digit growth rates, you're going to have to come down as you become the world's second largest economy. But the challenge is, can they hit their 5% targets or not? And what does that mean? And I think there's some real challenges to that structurally that are going to maybe make that more difficult than the government thinks and require them to take some different approaches. I guess the question, how do we get here? And I think the answer is moving from a developing economy to an advanced one is always difficult. And what China's done has been really spectacular to get to this place, but they did it with very heavy reliance on industrialization to give them time to build up the consumer economy. And the mismatch there and the imbalance that exists today, I think, is part of the problem that China has. And as the world is becoming more fragmented, it's going to be harder to get both sides working where they can be the world's largest exporter and build a consumer economy and believe that corporations around the world will be happy with them moving the way they're moving. I think what really upset the apple cart was the property and stock market problems, which have led to a confidence problem. And when confidence hits, you slow consumption. And to get up to a balanced economy, you need a better consumption and balance between consumption and investment and private and corporate support. And I think they've done some things to gut the corporate market a bit too. Some of them may be good long-term decisions, but might be challenging in the short term. So while the rally was quite good, there is more work to do. As you look back to where we were in May, in June, the market's come down a lot. It has more work to do to get back to where it was, to pare the losses, to build up confidence. But that's led to the worst consumer confidence going back to 1992, according to their National Bureau of Statistics. So this is not our view. This is as reported through the FT from the National Bureau of Statistics. I think one of the big underlying problems right now is the youth unemployment rising again. And when you have 11.5 million people graduating from schools, from universities, going into this type of unemployment market, it's not a great setup for social stability. I think there are other things the government's doing because they're concerned about that is kind of displaying a bit of a heavier hand than I think is healthy for the Chinese economy. The front page of the FT yesterday had an interesting article on China requesting that teachers turn in their passports and other public servants turn in their passports, and you have to go through a long process to get approved for travel. I think there's concerns about capital outflows and including that as human capital. And I think that's not the sign of a economy that's about to bust out, but one that's really on a very fragile footing. And foreign investors have reacted to the situation. They've been increasingly bearish over the last several years after a run where if you weren't in China, you're missing the mark. I think what we've seen more recently, particularly in the last 4 years, but really in the last year, is significant changes in flows, and that impacts confidence, and that also leads to challenges. And when you have the tariffs and the other wars starting, that's not going to be helpful either. And what does it mean for corporations? This is a chart that kind of gives the top 100 firms capitalization and the ownership interest. And as you can see, the move from 2010 to 20 showed growing reduced exposure of the Chinese government. And now you're seeing it start to pick up again, including really the push to have party members on board seats and things like that. And, how does that appeal to the free market system is one of the things we have to talk about. But this is also impacting VC fundraising and startups. And as you can see, the shift in startups from 51,000 down to 1,200 last year is pretty startling. And I think this is part of the challenge. And while I think there's amazing opportunities in China, I think it's going to be hard to get the scale that they need to reverse some of the challenges without much more stimulus and even more friendly, more open policies towards the West, which are going to be hard to do given the current geopolitical climate. So I think it's going to be really interesting to see. And Francis is going to speak in a few minutes and give his views of what the 5 scenarios are possibly for how China moves going forward. And I think it's really important to get a sense of that. But the U.S. rate cuts actually cleared the way for China to ease more aggressively. This is a chart showing expectations from Bloomberg economists of rates, borrowing cost shifts between now and the end of the year. I suspect that China will move to the red and be lower, but we'll have to see, because I think that's going to be part of what's necessary to stimulate the housing demand. They are going to pull out some stops that they've used in their old playbook to maybe do the cars for clunkers and other things to stimulate demand in other ways. But I'm sorry. But they've done a lot so far. The government is pushing towards 7% of GDP. But for perspective, when from 20 to 24 or 23, the U.S. put about 50% of GDP to work. So is the 7% enough to really move things or not? We'll have to see. I think the problems are deep. The structural issues are not easy to resolve with short-term measures, and I think there are longer-term things that have to be put in place. And from my perspective, one of them is better relations with the West. And I think behavior on the West and from China have to improve, and the tit-for-tat stuff going on is not going to help confidence or longer-term investments, which are needed both by companies and by the governments to deal with the problem. So a lot of people wonder where we go from here. This is a partial list of the policy actions since the start of the year, and that was 5.4% of GDP, about $1 trillion. I think there's more to come. I think you'll see them pushing for things that don't put too much strain on local governments, because I think that's the big issue from my perspective that is holding them back from being more aggressive, is the kind of off-the-books debts that exist in the system. So where do we go from here, and what do people think? There's 2 very different opinions. Here's Tepper and Druckenmiller. I think short-term Tepper's right. I think longer term, if we don't get more collaboration with the West and move away from the battles between the US and China and the West and the autocratic nations. I think Druckenmiller may be right for Western investors. That said, from a VC perspective, I think there are, and even public markets, there are opportunities to invest where the government is going to be supportive, but I think there's going to be issues that make it not as easy as it was for the earlier part of the China miracle, and more like it's been for the last several years, with confusing policies and more difficult challenges to make long-term strategic investments against the backdrop. So, Mark, I'm going to stop there and take a couple questions, then we'll get to Francis's discussion, if we have any questions.
I'm on mute. Questions, comments to Stephen?
I have a quick question. Do you think that is there any correlation between our lowering interest rates in the U.S. versus China's stimulus? I mean, how are those related? Did that impact?
The rate cut allowed China to be more aggressive because it wouldn't strengthen the dollar too much. The dollar would have strengthened too much against China if China cut rates and we kept our rates where they were, and we would be sucking more capital out of the rest of the world into the US because of the yield differentials. So our rate cuts allow other economies to be more aggressive given the dollar's reserve status. So I do think it mattered to allow them to be a little bit more liberal in what they do. Whether they take it, how aggressive they take advantage of, it's another story.
So in one way, that seems like a form of collaboration, you know? I mean, it's more implicit, but it's us, in a way, kind of working together, just to put a positive spin on it.
Yeah, I would say if there was collaboration, there would be a positive spin, but I don't think there's collaboration on this. I think the Fed cut rates for the Fed's reasons, and China's doing what they're doing for their reasons, but can do it more easily because of the Fed cut. I think what's more important, and I'm curious from Francis's perspective, is their military leader coming over to meet with Austin, I think, is really important. Because I think a lot of what's going on gets to the geopolitics, which then bleeds into the economics. And I think the geopolitics are holding long-term investments back from outside of China, mainly from the US and Western companies. And so I think that's the issue that I think is more exists. I would like to put a more positive spin, and I would like to see them do what we did more following the global financial crisis, where we got together with our monetary authorities and really figured out a way to do it. But that goes back to the relationships that existed mainly with Paulson and Bernanke and some of the Chinese leaders. I don't think we have that same type of relationship today at a government level, but I'm not 100% sure on that.
I don't buy Druckenmiller, I'll say that. I mean,
I'm sorry?
Just the Druckenmiller take, communist policies, leadership change, to me that shows true, just on its face. I mean, it's obviously it's in the middle here, but I would question someone who says that without a leadership change and a shift from current communist policies, because it's so much more nuanced than communist.
I think, I agree with the extremes here, both of them. I don't think I'd buy everything, and I don't think I wouldn't invest without a leadership change. But there is the shift in their policies over the last couple of years, I think, is not immaterial, and I think it has been. I think there's some aggressiveness to it that is not consistent with what the drivers of the early miracle were. Mm-hmm. And I'm not sure personally if this isn't more about Xi's aspirations than China's aspirations, where I think some of that's coming from. So I don't know. I don't think this Chinese leadership is the Chinese leadership and approach that got them this far. This is where my take on it, but I would say throw it out and listen to what the next speaker is going to say as Francis goes. But Mark, if there are other questions, I'm happy to take them, but I think it would be good to shift.
Yeah, I think we'll continue this theme as Francis is going to, and if you could also introduce yourself, Francis. We've known you since 2020. I feel like was it pre-COVID or during COVID?
No, I think we were COVID babies.
Okay. There we go.
Well, I wanted to start with sharing some slides to level set. I don't know if I'm allowed to or not, or
yeah, you're allowed.
Yeah.
Francis, maybe give a little bit about your background too.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I run a consulting shop out of Shanghai. We focus primarily on private equity, venture-backed organizations, mostly coming out of North America and Europe, performance improvement, growth strategies, M&A advisory, serve as operating partners basically for many of the firms that either needed augmented resources out here or don't have their own resources in China, where I'm based. I'm based out of Shanghai. I've been doing this for about the last 30 years, originally from the US. Let me put this up in full screen mode. If that's going to work for you guys?
Sure.
And Francis, along the way, feel free to answer Joel's question on Druckenmiller's take and others. So he gets a Chinese perspective as opposed to a US one.
Okay. Let's go on. Okay, so I wanted to start with just kind of level setting. I'll do some quick synopsis of maybe if people haven't done this before, looked at China. I mean, looking at China's GDP growth over the last sort of this long time period of 60 years, it's incredible to sort of see how much they've actually grown. Mm-hmm. And then those growth rates have been relatively strong for a long period of time. I shorten this up a little bit and I go to, it's not, okay. If I shorten it up to the same numbers that Stephen was using before, and you just take a look at the absolute GDP number on the left and then the growth rate on the right, I think it becomes clear that sometimes the growth rate is really not that important when you take a look at the scale of just how big this place has gotten so quickly. We're talking about 13% CAGR over this time period of the GDP. On the right-hand side, you're also seeing the GDP per capita number on the right axis, which is now at about $12,000-$13,000. And what's interesting about that is that if you take a look at the broader population, it's basically concentrated all in about 93 cities is where the whole structure of the economy is shifting towards. So the right-hand side is showing that in 2020, the concentration of the share of the population is 27% in 55 cities. And over the next 7 years, we're concentrating more and more in the cities. And so it's 44% of the population, which is 900 million consumers. So it's a tremendous opportunity set, regardless of almost what the GDP numbers do. So if we grow by 2%, we're going to add 3.5 trillion to the economy. Or if we grow by 5%, we're adding 10 trillion. We're doubling the economy by 2030. So I think keeping in mind what's transpired and where this is going is quite important. And then one other thing, Andy Rothman from Matthews Ava published this today, talking about just over the period from 2020 to today, the Chinese households put $9.2 trillion in savings. So there's an enormous amount of money waiting in it to sort of get spent and be targeted at a very small concentration, like 93 cities. So when we talk about the direct equity market or the public equity markets, and we have all of these sort of structural problems, political problems, I think sometimes we get too lost in those weeds and don't pull back and say, okay, what is the little piece of grass that I need to make grow? And can I do that? And in the piece that we just published, which I shared just on this in the chat, we showed how Lululemon did it basically. Lululemon started in 2017 with 3 stores in China and virtually no sales. And today they have 127 stores in China and almost $1 billion in sales, which makes them basically the number 2 market for Lululemon. And if they continue on their current trajectory, then they're going to be having additional 100 stores over the next 3 years and probably doubling their revenue again. So it's important to sort of listen to what's happening in Washington and Beijing, and then also there's a part of it which is absolutely meaningless. Now, the piece also talks about, I think what Stephen was most interested in the note that we were talking about was scenario planning for the future of China. We have an analysis that basically we look at the probable outcomes of them being basically 5: a successful China, a confrontational China, a China that's reformed, a China that's restrained, and a China that's very, very shaky. Now, let me explain a little bit, basically the drivers, and maybe I'll take a different graphic to show what I think is going on here, and tip my hand and say that I think that shaky China is the one that we're most likely to experience. And that's because of the things that everyone talks about, the 3Ds, demographics, debt, deflation, the geopolitics. These things are all really, they've been a mess. I would say you can argue they've been a mess for almost 10, 15 years now. The reform process has basically stopped. I don't know that I would blame everything on one leader. I think that it's a concerted effort by the governing elite to try and protect their interests, and their inability to release any type of control is killing the geese that are laying the golden eggs. What's driving the changes as to whether or not which one of those 5 scenarios is going to be the outcome is this sense of these balancing things that are here. On the stability side, you have great human and physical capital, fantastic infrastructure, a very, very deep supply chain. But then we have these tensions, socioeconomic stress, and then state control, high or low. So if we go back to this slide, you'll see that if socioeconomic stress is very, very high and state control is high, then this idea of war in Taiwan, South Pacific Seas, that's more and more likely. But if socioeconomic stress is high and the state control is low, there's a whole collection of people who really want to reform and get out of the way, because the CCP was making a lot of money then too. And now a lot of people realize that the economy is completely screwed. And it's been, they've been driving from ditch to ditch for the last 4 or 5 years. And I would say that the first sort of part of the current administration's tenure, they could still hide a lot of the errors that they were making because there was so much residual success to feed off of. In the piece that we have, I tried to look at these 5 scenarios and provide what I think are odds of these, if you were betting, and then the probability of these things happening. So, for example, I think there's a 45% chance we're going to be in the sort of the shaky area. And if you can manage your business, you're still going to have a positive return. And then at that point, throughout the shaky period, you'll have to look out for civil unrest and institutional failure, because these 2 things are, whether you call them gray swans or black swans or gray rhinos, whatever you want to call them, these things are out there. And they're coming at us. I don't know how bad they're going to be, but peasant rebellion is something that constantly repeats itself in China. And so I would say the way we're going right now, that looks like the path is civil unrest and institutional failure. But I do think that as we approach the shaky period, in 2027, there's another party Congress. And at that point, if the economy is still performing as poorly as it has been, and I don't even think that the West has been, notwithstanding all of the negative sort of anti-communist rhetoric and all that nonsense, it's extreme. I still don't think that people understand just how poorly the economy is performing right now. The real estate overhang, I think even in an efficient market, would probably take a decade to digest. And they're still building. It's insane. They're still building because they think that it's like rent control or whatever. They're making very, very bad policy decisions. This thing about taking teachers' passports away, random changes to policies to take very successful entrepreneurs out of business. It's for lack of a better word, it's just dumb. What I like to focus on is that I think that there is a higher chance of reform than there is of confrontation. And each call that I take with a client where all they want to talk about is the coming collapse of, Taiwan or whatever, or the war with the Philippines, I want to sort of shake people and say, yeah, but reform is also as likely an outcome. So why can't we prepare for both instead of being a deer in the headlights with the current situation? I would like to close on just one thing regarding the equity markets. I think the equity markets are a complete sham. And so from a direct equity perspective, I think you're just playing momentum. And what happened today, the first day the market opened and the government sort of was supposed to announce new policies, from what I heard, a lot of the state-backed money that went in, they all exited today. So it's a mess, and I think it's still going to get even messier. But I'm still here. I'll end there.
Francis, the higher savings rate, which is a big positive if it does get spent, but is it going to get spent is the question in the environment we're in, because a lot of people are worried where they're going to put it, real estate or the housing market, right? So what do they do with the money? The hope is that they consume, but they're not doing that really to the degree that they should be either, right? So how do they get the balance in the economy?
They're still worried about employment, which is, I think, even worse than your statistics, because you did not mention that and I'm sure you know this, but they changed the reporting, right? Yeah. If you don't like the statistics, just change them.
Yeah.
And I think that's, it's mind-boggling how silly it is. Yep. You realize that we're dealing with basically a group of alcoholics who have not recognized that they have a problem.
How does reform take shape, in your view?
Very messy, very messy. I don't think that it's civil war, but I think that it might be something akin to how Hu Jintao was, sort of unceremoniously kicked out of the party Congress. Is that at a certain point they just say, okay, well we extended your period as the leader because you felt that we needed to continue to squash corruption and we needed more time. And basically the general, the funny thing also is that up until probably 2021, I would say the average person in China was fully supportive of everything the government was doing to quell COVID. And then enough is enough. Like we're done, right? We got to move on. And people were jumping out of windows, and none of that got reported. Everyone's got someone who died. Like if you take a look at the COVID death rates in China today, they still think that they're like zero. No one died of COVID in China. But everyone has a relative who died during that period. So it's mind-boggling how stupid they think people are.
Well, can I ask, Francis, you mentioned peasant revolts. I saw the first street protests, partly because of what you said of how they were dealing with COVID. But how do you see change like that happen? And what kind of, what manifestations from the bottom?
Well,
and then given unemployment rates that are this really interesting among the youth.
yeah, I think that they're so in control of what people are thinking because everyone basically lives their lives online that those things can happen without the drama that we may have seen in the past. And that, if you take a look at the demonstration that happened, sort of that white paper event in Shanghai, there was like 300 people. But then the national policy changed. I wouldn't say it changed because of that demonstration. It changed because they had probably 400 million like signs in WeChat. And they figure, oh, we got a problem here. Or they might not even have had that. They might have just had people who spent another few seconds so they knew they read it and were more interested than not, right? Because people are so afraid of, they all know they're being watched in everything they say and do. So I'm not so sure that it has to be as dramatic. I mean, I think it could be that the people in the party who are reading these numbers are looking at it and say, okay, buddy, you got to go because we're all going to die if you stay in power. And I think one of the things that a lot of people in the West overestimate is you always see Xi Jinping's name as if it's his policy. He's just the guy at the top of the ticket, right? Like there's a whole organization which is that he's beholden to as well. And he was given this mandate. And so I think that it can be taken away eventually. Now, it could be very messy, like the fall of Mao Zedong, where you have that senile period and then you have to wait until they die. It's not like you have a 25th Amendment or something like that.
Well, let me just ask another question. Then Russia and China's basically propping it up, or just enough, some would say, until they take it over.
Yeah.
What's your view on some of those geopolitical? We'll keep Africa and resources to the side.
Yeah, I think that China's been a big beneficiary. They've gotten cheap oil. They've gotten a lot of military technology. They've made the West spend a lot of money. I think they kind of bet that this could be something that would drive a wedge. It might drive a wedge between the US and Europe. A miscalculation on their part. And they seem to be doing that with all of their closest friends, like North Korea and Iran and Syria. So in some ways, I think that they overplayed their hand, right? It was the hubris of being so successful. They're really betting on chaos in the West as a demonstration of the relative power or the relative benefit of being in a one-party state. So if there is, you'll see in the piece that we wrote, and then also the piece that we reference in the note, that if there's chaos in the West, that helps drive the authority level for the Chinese leadership. So if China is successful, it's going to be partially because their relative performance to Western economies, right? So if we shoot our president and then shoot another civil rights leader and go into chaos and burn our cities like we did in the 60s, then China is going to be more emboldened, I think, to do some things and maybe look successful to their population in relation. Right now, they don't look successful in relation to the rest of the world. And if you ask the average person on the street, if they're talking to you honestly, they're going to say, we don't want to be friends with these knuckleheads, right? We don't. You can see in the humor, the joking about we don't want to be North Korea. So that goes back to like that's a form of peasant rebellion, 2024 in China, because all those comments are being collected and someone's doing chat bot to tell them what all that means, right?
Right. Good point.
Francis, what's your view of the Belt and Road? Successful or not?
Not. I mean, I think that they won some friends, but I think it's vendor financing that was very expensive, that did very little to help countries build out their own capabilities. So they bought a lot of expensive Chinese stuff, or relatively expensive Chinese stuff, and then under terms that were not transparent, and really were more about corrupting certain leaders or co-opting certain leaders than actually doing anything meaningful for the countries. So I don't know that it's as a form of soft power. I would say it's a relative failure.
I'm curious. Number one, are you able to join us at 11?
That's
It would be great. You get a much bigger group. And second, how if I spent 8 years in Russia, and they're also tracking every word. We always had this joke that our mobile phone, you lose the conversation because the recording machine broke or ended. So our phone call had to end. But you're very direct, and I've never seen anyone in China criticize their country in any of my conversations, in country and sometimes out. But you're able to speak freely sitting in Shanghai. I guess you're part of a complement of augmentation of foreign investment, and therefore they see that as a positive thing.
Yeah, I think they know how I feel, right? And I'm not advocating for any political change. I don't do this publicly as a journalist. So I'm doing it with an investor community. I've brought more than enough money to this country. So I think that, and I'm frankly, Mark, I'm surprised that I haven't gotten the call for tea. I suspect my house is bugged, like in some shape or form, but I don't like, they know what I think, right? It's not, so, it's interesting that, Andy Rothman, whose pieces I've referenced a couple of times, he recently came out and publicly called Xi Jinping stubborn, which, like people, and if you take a look at some of the best sinologists that are out there, Yang Da Li at the University of Chicago, Huang Yashan at MIT, these guys have come out, written books recently that have been scathing. And it's reached a point where for me, I don't even know if I care anymore. Like if they're going to continue to go down this path, there's nothing for me to do. It's like, there's still great opportunities. Like this Lululemon thing, it's a real thing. Right? Hermes grew by 15% in China last year. It's a real thing. BASF invested $10 billion, or committed $10 billion. So like and the returns are there. So Tesla is a good example. Apple still got 20% of their sales here. So like all this stuff it's still an opportunity.
On the other side though.
What's that?
What's that, Stephen?
Where they're not sourcing the cotton from the Uyghurs, and they're putting them in the penalty box now. So, and they keep going after companies for tit for tat stuff that I don't know if it's going to.
Oh, I see some hands up. Sorry, I just saw this. Chris and Joel. Sorry, guys. Chris, you have a question?
Yeah. So, I mean, how prepared is the larger Chinese economy as we sort of bifurcate into two global economies, and China finds itself locked out of value-added or high-value manufacturing in Europe and the U.S., which that's the market for high-value manufacturing, really. I mean, what's the impact on their economy? I mean, how do they address that? Are they addressing it even?
Well, I don't know that they're really short of all that much. They seem to have lots of workarounds.
Yeah, like Mexico.
Mexico being one, they will set up organizations all over the world to mask identities. You know, some of the simpler ones we've seen by setting up, you know, holding companies in Singapore and then investing from those. You know, I think there are some areas that are non-obvious. So the bearings that are used for the high-speed trains are still coming from Germany. So there's, you know, they can make the trains go slower if Germany were to choose not to send bearings to China. But I don't know that, if I understand your question, Chris, is that I'm not so sure that I would say that there's really that much that is missing that it would make a significant difference to the Chinese economy. And if we were to go down that path, then we would be in a tit for tat war where we would then be, China would then be cutting off the global buyers as well. So that
I was thinking more specifically around sort of the IoT of things, where, you know, they're going to, you know, everybody's afraid of the EV, but part of that is just a national security concern, at least at the governmental level, because those things are just roving, you know, electronic spies.
Yeah.
You know, and so, I mean, part of it is dumping and economic, but that's also a concern that the Europeans have about Chinese EVs. And that was more where my question was going, is that, you know, as you sort of break out, at least around the tech economy, you know, how do they do that? But you could be right. They can do it by proxies.
People are doing it by proxies, and you even see the biggest venture funds who were invested directly in China. They've now bifurcated their organizations, and I think that's if the shaky period continues to go down a path of us versus them, then I think the average, particularly U.S. investor, if not European investor, wants to have some veil of plausible deniability that they're actually domiciled in the United States or Europe. So that, you know, if you're selling French cognac and the French sell MiGs to or whatever the French airplanes are to the Taiwanese, that they don't get caught up in that nonsense. So I think that there are sophisticated ways to play this game that have to get outside of the politics and the morality, and just back to the understanding that, okay, I'm in the venture capital business. I'm in the business of deploying risk capital. I don't care about politics of, you know, whether we should or should not have prison labor doing work. Like I don't want to, like, that's China's problem in Xinjiang. That's not my issue. And I, you know, some people are not comfortable with that, you know, moral compromise. And if you're not, then get out of that business, you know. But if you're deploying risk capital, and I'm paid to deploy risk capital, then I should figure the workaround.
Joel?
Yeah. Yeah, thank you for your presentation. And I just, I'm trying to circle back to where we were before we took the other question. So I'm trying to reset my mind. But just, you know, I've been going to and from China since '92 as well. And I understand what you're saying, but being on the ground, and you see it in Shanghai, the quality of life compared to 10, 20, 30 years ago has monumentally changed. And so as much as Chinese people may be feeling reticence toward the government, I think there still is quite a bit of support if you check across the country compared to where it was during COVID and before COVID. Yeah, it's likely lower. But I just wonder about your take on like the gig economy, the space that I'm seeing for people to do business digitally on WeChat. And I just, I experienced something in June, Shanghai, Hangzhou, Shaoxing, Chongqing was something that just blew my mind because when I was previously in China in 2017, it didn't feel like that. And just seeing the infrastructure where it is now and the prevalence of EVs and the tech and just kind of where things are going, I really kind of appreciate how you've kind of created this X and Y axis of what's possible. And I kind of feel like this whole Taiwan, South China Strait thing is a bit of a diversion that we tend to focus on, and we get kind of caught up in how China can do things so wrong and the threat while they're doing things to expand and grow, but getting more deeper insight into, and the economy does really seem to be in tough straits, but from my familial point of view in the country, things anecdotally seemed really amazing to me. So how do I strike a balance between what I'm seeing anecdotally, what I'm seeing, and understanding all the problems that are going on, and the fact that you're going to stick it out? Life in Shanghai is great. I hope to spend more time there.
Well, I have a very pleasant house. I live down a lane that's quiet. The air is extremely clean now. There are more coffee shops than you can shake a stick at, bread, all
More
that
than any
stuff.
country in the
But
world.
the next time you come, bring your bike and I'll take you on some roads and show you some real estate, and you're going to look at it and you're going to wonder how is that ever going to get digested? And so the Chinese have been operating as if the laws of finance don't apply to them, and they apply to everywhere. It's gravity. And then the same thing when you go out into the third, fourth, fifth tier cities, and you see the beginning of what maybe Cincinnati or Canton, Ohio felt like in the late 70s and 80s as the businesses started to move away and the young people all started to move away. We burned cities when things like when the social dynamics didn't work. There's no vent in China for that to happen. And there are a lot of people who are not making it.
Yeah.
So the 900 million people that I talked about that are living in the cities, okay, maybe they're going to be okay, but that still leaves another, I don't know, 500 million that aren't making it. So there are a lot of structural issues that have not been addressed, and there's a lot of things that on the surface look as if they're functioning well. But when you know the backstory to some of these things, you're like, oh, that's why that property's been dormant for 12 years. But you wouldn't know that if you just came to the city and saw a dormant property, right? You'd have to have lived through that. And there's so much of that right now that I think someone was saying there's 100 million apartments that are basically underutilized or vacant. That's a lot, right?
Yeah.
How does that get digested? If not for there's no mechanism for change, except if the vision of the anointed say it's time to change. And I don't think that they have much vision at this point. I mean, they haven't demonstrated, particularly around the economy. They've made some good choices, right, in terms of focusing on EV and the infrastructure, but all that has to be, well, in terms of EV, I would say out of the 100 companies that are in that space right now, 10 years from now, maybe 10 will be around. Enormous waste of capital.
Yeah.
So, there are all these train stations that they've built and all these lines that they've built where the utilization rates they're just not economical. So over time, someone's going to have to pay to maintain those lines, and then it doesn't work.
And then,
If you take a
Bill,
look at the
and
product,
Francis, with the local debts that are on the system right now, which are in the trillions, how hard is it to get it to work later on when debt's the current consumption of future earnings, right? You've borrowed
correct.
from the future
Yeah,
for stuff that somebody's got to take.
yeah.
I don't know how that works.
It
So
doesn't
It's
work.
not
It's
getting
never
covered.
worked.
So there's no such thing as a socialist market economy.
It's a sham, right? It's never worked.
Okay, because I've been trying to come to terms with that for 30 years. What does that actually mean? And how can something like that actually function? Because when I first heard that, I'm like, that's not possible.
Right.
And maybe it's not, but it's just an interesting dynamic, and it's trying to do something maybe that hasn't been done in other ways. And yeah, there's a lot of flaws for sure.
And with the U.S. now being an enemy,
Yeah.
and okay, we'll drive a wedge between the U.S. and Europe. Oh, well, that didn't work. And so what's left? The 30% of the global GDP that goes to the so-called global South, and then they're not the leader of the global South, at least not if you ask the other 206 countries that are in there. I guess like I don't know, maybe 30% of them would in their heart of hearts tell you that they are. They might all raise their hand in a General Assembly meeting, but they're not in.
But are they really in with the US then, as well? I mean, that's the thing. I mean, we're both struggling.
Yeah, I think if you were to ask them to vote with their feet, they would walk to the United States. They wouldn't
Would.
walk to China.
Yet there you are in China, and I'm like eager to.
It works for me. It works for me. Like it's
absolutely.
yeah. But if I don't educate my children here, I don't, so I don't, without change, I don't see how it holds together.
All right. Well, thank you. I'll stop there if others want to ask questions.
Mark, I have to jump, but Francis, thank you for joining today. It's awesome. Correct all my mistakes, so thank you.
I
I agree with you on
Thanks, guys.
the long-term success they've had. It's nothing short of a miracle, as I started this with. But are they going to blow the miracle is the question that I have right now. And I'm with you. Without some change in how they're approaching internally and externally, they're going to keep going the way they're going right now. It's not good.
yeah. Read the Shaky China report. It's really well done.